We'll have a link hopefully to YouTube on here so that you can see these awards. In the past, I've noticed that not a lot of people look at it, and I'd like to have more people do it. We'd like to do a little bit more of this. And you can push the button now, Joe.
We're good.
All right. You already did. Gary Dickey is a founding member of Dickey and Campbell Law Firm, whose practice focuses primarily on criminal defense, personal injury, and regulatory litigation. Upon graduation from Drake University Law School in 2002, he clerked for the Honorable Harold Viator, U.S. District Court Judge for the Southern District of Iowa. After briefly practicing with the Bull Law Office in Des Moines, Gary joined the officer of Governor Tom Vilsack and Lieutenant Governor Peterson as General Counsel and Policy Director. While with the Governor's office, he drafted Executive Order Number 42. Everybody in here should know what Executive Order Number 42 is, which restored the right to vote in Iowa for tens of thousands of ex-felons that had already completed their sentences. In addition to trying high-profile cases, Gary is one of Iowa's leading appellate attorneys on complex issues of civil and criminal law, regularly arguing before the Iowa Supreme Court. He has successfully briefed and argued dozens of cases before state and federal appeals courts. Most notably, he assisted in drafting the brief submitted to the United States Supreme Court on behalf of the prevailing party in Barrage v. United States. Does any non-lawyer in this room know what the holding was in Barrage? Does any lawyer know? It was, well, I'll let Gary explain it. It was a 2014 case that was a unanimous decision in the United States Supreme Court. He's also a widely recognized source of legal and political advice for candidates seeking public office in Iowa. For over 10 years, he's assisted in voter protection efforts of presidential campaigns. He's served as legal counsel to numerous campaigns for offices ranging from Des Moines City Council to the United States Senate. And, I put an emphasis on the word and, because I follow him on Twitter, I know I should not have begun that sentence with the conjunction. That's because Gary is a master of syntax and a follower of the boss. You know what the boss is? You know who the boss is? Oh my God, Gary, you got a lot of explaining.
Bruce Springsteen.
Bruce Springsteen?
Oh.
You should have said music box.
Gary lives in Des Moines with his wife, 2 children, and 3 dogs. Liberty, justice, and freedom.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. I am so delighted to be here and in front of some familiar faces that I haven't seen for a long time. Carlos, it's good to see you. I was asked to visit about Executive Order 42 that I had the opportunity to be a part of. It is something that I put in every biographical introduction. It's on my website. It is one of my top accomplishments of which I'm most proud. And I'd love to stand here and tell you that it was all my idea, when in reality it wasn't. And there's a wonderful backstory to the creation of Executive Order 42 that I want to share with you today. When I was preparing my remarks, to kind of capture what I wanted to share with you, there's a couple of quotes. The first one I couldn't find, but if you've ever seen President Obama at a political rally, I had the privilege of being at his last rally in the East Village during the last election. If you remember, there's the classic picture where he's got the tear coming down his cheek. But he would end a rally with this rousing kind of remark, and that is, if you could get a room full of people who are committed to change, then they can go out and they can make change in their neighborhood. And if you can get a neighborhood committed to change, you can get a city. And if you can get a city, you can get a state. And if you can get a state, you can get a country, and then you can change the world. So obviously he does that much more eloquent, but it really, I think it really captures the story behind Executive Order 42. I came across another quote, I'm sure you've all heard of it, and that's from the cultural anthropologist Margaret Mead. where she's attributed saying, quote, "Never doubt that a small group of thoughtful, committed citizens can change the world. Indeed, it's the only thing that ever has." And so I'll try to tie that up at the end with the story of Executive Order 42. A lawyer by nature, I feel like I always need to start out kind of giving you the legal issue, as we've been trained in law school to do. I'm sure you're all aware Iowa's Constitution has a provision. At the time when I was in the governor's office, it said that no idiot or insane person or anybody who has been convicted of an infamous crime shall have the privilege of an elector. Since that time, it's been changed, and it's been changed. They've taken out the insensitive language and changed it to anybody who has lost the right to vote because they're mentally incompetent. But because of that, thousands of people every year in the state of Iowa lose the right to vote. In the Iowa Code, at the time of Section 914.2, it set out this process by which those individuals who had lost their right to vote could apply to the governor's office to have their rights restored. We call it a restoration of citizenship rights, which includes both the right to vote and the right to hold public office. When Governor Vilsack took office, he, for the most part, carried forward the procedures for restoring rights and clemency and commutations. But he had a professor at the University of Iowa kind of look over and give substantive recommendations in terms of criteria that he ought to be considering. But nobody, until Executive Order 42 within the office, had thought about looking at the process itself to determine whether or not that was a fair process. In hindsight, looking back, it's pretty clear it wasn't. When I came into the governor's office, the process for applying for a restoration of citizenship rights was the same for a pardon and for a commutation. And you would apply, the governor's office would take it, we would do an initial screening, we would send it over to the Board of Parole, we'd ask the Board of Parole to do an investigation, we'd ask the Board of Parole for a recommendation. Board of Parole would do an investigation. Sometimes they would get DCI, the Division of Criminal Investigation, involved. They'd send it back to us with a recommendation. If there's anything incomplete at any part of that process, you send it back out to the applicant, and that whole process starts over. It was very important to Governor Vilsack that these applications for clemency be done by the book. That is, first in, first out, so that no matter who you are, no matter who you know, no matter how rich you are, you can't get to the top of the line in terms of a consideration for clemency. It came in at the time that your application was filed. When I first got there, that process was anywhere between 18 and 24 months to have your right to vote be restored, because it was the same process with a pardon. And if you recall, Governor Vilsack, one of the things that he did was this kind of push to reinvent government. So we brought in all of these public administration experts to take a look at all of our processes and see if we couldn't streamline things and do things better. We took part in one of those for the restoration of citizenship rights process. And how they have you do it is you chart on the wall every single interaction that comes in contact with that application until it's finally reached the governor's office and make a decision. By the end of the day, we had steps all along the wall, and the point of the process was to try to develop which ones we could take out to streamline it, because a lot of it was cumbersome and unnecessary. So by the time we left, for those people who had applied through the application process, we were able to get it down from 18 to 24 months down to 6 months or less, just by trying to make government more efficient. But still, for all the reasons that you're all aware of, it wasn't a very efficient, it wasn't a very effective way of restorative justice. Fast forward to the 2003 legislative session, and a group of young people from Metro High School in Cedar Rapids took it upon themselves as a class project. They had a teacher, Mike Cervantes, And I understand now Mike does reentry programming in the Iowa City area. So Mr. Cervantes had his class find an issue that they would follow during that legislative session, and to come up to the Capitol and actively lobby for that. The issue that they decided on, and I don't know the backstory as to why, but the issue was restoration of voting rights for ex-felons. And so what they did is they researched the issue, contacted legislators, which culminated in the drafting of House File 402, which was sponsored by Representatives Racker, Maddox, Elgin, Yoakum, and Asher. What's important about that is those first three names are Republicans, and the last two are Democrats. So these high school students were able to get bipartisan support for their issue. Deb Berry, who is also a representative out of Waterloo, sponsored another bill that's identical. So it's 3 Republicans and 3 Democrats. They came up to the Capitol and they met with me in the governor's office to tell me what they were doing. They met with each of those legislators. That bill was referred to a subcommittee. It passed unanimously out of the subcommittee. It was referred to the entire state government committee, passed with a recommendation that it be passed. And for whatever reason, perhaps political reasons, it just stalled in 2003 and in 2004. So the students, undeterred, met with Racker and Representative Racker and Elgin and Vicki Lensing at the time from Iowa City. She was on the subcommittee, and we all got together and met. And the message from the legislators and the students were, if we can't do anything legislatively, is there something, anything that Governor Vilsack can do administratively or through executive order? And so frankly, you know, as proud as I am of Executive Order 42, this was purely a product of efforts of high school students. But once I looked at the issue, you know, we looked at some options. One of the things we did is what Governor Bush, then Governor Bush of Texas, you know, future President Bush, he had passed legislation in Texas that created a blanket restoration of voting rights for ex-felons. And so what we tried to do with Executive Order 42 is to model it after what Governor Bush had done in Texas. So when I took the proposal to Governor Vilsack, he was on board right from the beginning. The concern, and it's at the time, and it was addressed in House File 402, was a requirement that you had to be current on your restitution and any court costs and fines as a precondition of getting your rights restored. And Governor Vilsack, right off the bat, frankly to my surprise, just dismissed any notion that there would be any type of financial barrier to anybody having the ability to vote. And right off the bat, recognized that there are people who are delinquent on financial affairs, people who have declared bankruptcy, and their rights to vote are not impacted. And so he rejected out of hand any requirement that it would be part of Executive Order 42. And he called it a poll tax, and I think that's what we all see that it is. So he tasked me with drafting Executive Order 42, and you fast forward to July 4th, 2005, and that date, as you probably know, Independence Day and a symbol of liberty was not a date that was chosen by accident. And so working with people like Carlos, people from the NAACP, Deb, you were there, we had a press conference to announce Executive Order 42, which did 3 things. The first, it created a blanket, essentially blanket restoration of citizenship rights for anybody who had been convicted but was no longer on probation or parole or had been discharged from prison. So we wouldn't have to go back and identify everybody and find out where they are. They could just get a copy of Executive Order 42, which we made available to every public library in the state of Iowa, every county auditor. And they could go and they could show that and they could register to vote and vote in the election. The second thing it did was create an automatic process going forward. The governor has virtually unlimited clemency authority, but we needed to have this process to get those individuals before the governor. So we used all of the technology at our disposal and created a process whereby at the end of each month, all of those individuals that were no longer on probation or parole or had discharged from prison would be sent to us on a list. We'd take it up to Governor Vilsack, he would look it over, and he would approve it, and then they would all get certificates in the mail to their last known address. And so through that, we were able to restore the right to vote for hundreds, thousands, if not tens of thousands of people going forward. The other thing that it did was maintain the application process, but in a much more streamlined way. So for example, a lot of people don't recognize that if you are convicted of a felony in another state, or if you're convicted of a federal felony offense, that prohibition against voting still applies in the state of Iowa, yet we don't really have a good mechanism of keeping track of all of those individuals. So it created a way where if you were from out of state with a conviction, you wanted to move back, you could go through that process. Or if you were from Iowa and moved out of state and needed Governor Vilsack's restoration, you could do that. So that was the process through the end of the Governor Vilsack administration. And thankfully, Governor Culver maintained that process, as I understand it, through his administration. The reason that we cited for Executive Order 42 is right there in the text of it. Number one, a belief that the right to vote is, if it's not the most precious, it's certainly one of the most precious fundamental rights in a democratic society. The disenfranchisement of felony offenders in Iowa has a disproportionate impact on minority populations. And that's been well chronicled in the press. It's been well chronicled even in Iowa judicial opinions, that as a proportion of our population, we incarcerate minority populations in a much higher rate. So that was one of the reasons. And the other was that evidence had, research had shown that for those offenders who are back in the community, who have the right to vote back, who register, that their likelihood of reoffending is significantly less. So in order, to make, it was really a public safety issue to reduce recidivism, we wanted to do our best to reintegrate our ex-felony offenders back into society. To give you a sense of the practical impact, in 2002 and 2003, the 2 years prior, out of 8,646 offenders who were transitioning off probation, parole, or discharging from prison, in other words, eligible offenders, only 366 had applied through the process. So only a very small portion of Iowa's felony population was even seeking to have their rights restored. Of those, about 80% of them were approved. Most of them were kind of technical rejections in terms of we didn't have all of the information, we needed more information, they would have to resubmit through the process. But at the time, prior to Executive Order 42, we asked the same questions asked today. Are you current on your court costs and fines? Have you paid all of your restitution? Are you current on, we looked at, I think we looked at child support obligations as well as a financial consideration. And those were things that were considered by the Board of Parole, who would give us a recommendation, and based on that, sometimes the Board of Parole would recommend against restoration. But what the research has shown is that for those individuals who did reapply, that out of the total population, about 8,600, those who did reapply, the 366, only 15% of those actually voted again. So you only have a fraction of the eligible population that's getting the right to vote back, and then of those who do, only a smaller fraction of them are actually participating in the election process. And so after Executive Order number 42, the research has shown, and there's a recent study that was done at the end of 2014, that the effect of Executive Order 42 was, of course, tens of thousands of individuals had the right to vote. They were registered, and they were voting at rates that were much higher than 15%. So we were seeing a great increase in participation in our democratic process. Fast forward to Governor Branstad's second term. As you know, he he issued Executive Order number 70, which did a couple of things. One is that it prospectively rescinded Executive Order 42. And when I say prospectively, that's an important dynamic because there's a lot of confusion out there if you have a felony offense as to whether you can vote, whether Executive Order 42 is still good law, whether Executive Order 70